In the last lesson, we learned that numerous civilizations existed across North America. However, historians have not always understood how complex these civilizations were. This is George Bancroft, 19th century American statesman, politician, educator, and one of the most prominent historians from that period. Listen to what he said about pre-European North America and its civilizations.
North America was an unproductive waste. Its only inhabitants were a few scattered tribes of feeble barbarians, destitute of commerce and political connections.
Misconceptions like these have heavily influenced how Native cultures and histories are presented. Today, we'll explore some common mistakes perpetuated by United States history. Our essential question is, how does the way people view Indigenous histories and cultures affect how we understand the history of the United States? Let's break this question down into some guiding questions. What are some traditional views and misconceptions about Indigenous histories and cultures? And why have traditional views and misconceptions towards Indigenous histories and cultures persisted in United States history? Luckily, you don't have to worry too much about all the historical misconceptions floating around United States history. Why? Well, you have MiaPrep, and we do not use the United States history textbook from 1987, which taught
For thousands of centuries, centuries in which human races were evolving, forming communities, and building the beginnings of national civilizations in Africa, Asia, and Europe, the continents we know as Americas stood empty of mankind and its works.
How might textbooks like these have impacted the way Americans thought about Native cultures? These kinds of textbooks promoted the view that Native cultures did not develop civilizations. This taught numerous misconceptions about Native cultures to millions of American schoolchildren. So let's dispel some of these misconceptions with the facts. One of the major cultural misconceptions about Indigenous histories and cultures is that they were all the same. But you know we cannot generalize any aspect of Indigenous culture because there was no one unified civilization. This idea has led to two other common misconceptions. First, that the people of the Americas did not have a concept of the ownership of individual property. And second, that there were no social classes within Indigenous cultures. Let's take a look at the last lesson's examples to dispel any misconceptions. First, let's look at how the Mississippian and Wampanoag cultures demonstrate that Indigenous civilizations had a concept of the ownership of individual property. We can see numerous structures of various size representing different degrees of wealth. The smaller buildings were individual homes owned by average citizens. Look at the larger buildings. They were owned by wealthier citizens or served as government buildings. Within the Wampanoag Confederation's territory, each tribe held political and economic control over specific inland and coastal land. For example, a tribe controlled a specific area along the coast for fishing. Within a tribe's coastal and inland territory, families owned specific plots of land where they resided and had gardens. Next, let's take a look at how the Mississippian culture demonstrates that Indigenous civilizations had social classes. In the Mississippian culture, large-scale agriculture resulted in larger populations, giving rise to specialized labor, meaning not everyone farmed. Look at the decorative items made by skilled craftsmen. Do you think everyone walked around with these around their necks or had them hanging in their homes? Probably not. These items were reserved for those who held specific positions and wealth. This is a picture of a man from the Mississippian culture wearing decorative items. He was part of the ruling class and had access to more goods. This tells us that some Native American civilizations had different social classes. Let's review what we've learned from the Mississippian culture and Wampanoag Confederacy. Remember, we said that there are two more misconceptions. One, the people of the Americas did not have a concept of the ownership of individual property. Two, there were no social classes within indigenous cultures. But we learned that both the Mississippian culture and the Wampanoag Confederacy had a concept of individual property, and the Mississippian culture had numerous social classes based on different degrees of wealth and power. Using the examples from the Mississippian culture and the Wampanoag Confederacy, answer the next guiding question. What are some common misconceptions about indigenous cultures and histories? Because European colonists, and later some Americans of European descent, did not appreciate the diversity of indigenous cultures, they developed a single approach to interacting with the different native civilizations. Let's take a look at two examples from different periods of United States history. First, the Wampanoag Confederacy signed the Wampanoag Pilgrim Treaty with the English colonists in New England to secure trade rights and help both the Europeans and the Wampanoag better defend themselves against rival native tribes. In exchange, the Wampanoag gave the colonists rights to the land within the Confederacy's territory. Take a moment and predict how the treaty impacted the Wampanoag Confederacy's control of the region. I'm going to pull up two maps for us to analyze. Remember this one? This shows the Wampanoag territory prior to the Pilgrims' arrival. Within less than 100 years, the same area looks like this. What's changed? The names of the settlements have changed from Wampanoag names to English names. On both maps, we see Plymouth, the original Pilgrim settlement where the treaty was signed, and from Plymouth, the Pilgrims spread out, taking more and more of Wampanoag territory. Why? Well, the treaty gave Pilgrims a foothold, allowing more and more to immigrate to the region. The colonists eventually outnumbered the Wampanoag and no longer needed their help, so the treaty was voided. The colonists formed a new treaty with a different group further inland and repeated the process. After the colonists gained independence from Great Britain, Americans pushed further and further west into the Ohio and Mississippi Valley, the Great Plains, the Southwest and California, the Northwest. The United States continued the pattern of forming new treaties with indigenous groups, increasing the number of settlers, and eventually violating the original agreement when it no longer benefited them. To illustrate the point, let's look into the relationship between the Muskogee Nation and the United States. The Muskogee Nation, known as the Creeks by most Americans, lived in what is now eastern Alabama and western Georgia. Divided into two regions, Upper and Lower, the Lower Muskogee adapted to American culture by growing cash crops for Western markets and even adopted slavery. The Upper Muskogee retained their traditional culture. As American settlers immigrated into Upper Muskogee territory, a group of fighters, known as the Red Sticks, fought against the Americans and their Muskogee collaborators in the Creek War of 1812 to 1814. The Americans and their indigenous allies defeated the Red Sticks in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, ending the war. The United States then forced all of the Muskogee, including the Americans' Lower Muskogee allies, to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which resulted in the U.S. taking 23 million acres of Muskogee land. The Americans' Muskogee allies protested the loss of their land, but Andrew Jackson, the leader of the American forces, said,
"We bleed our enemies in such cases to give them their senses."
By referring to the Lower Muskogee as enemies, Andrew Jackson justified their forced removal. To Jackson and many in the United States, it did not matter whose side the Lower Muskogees were on. They were still obstacles in the way of expansion. By the 1830s, the United States government had forced most of the native peoples east of the Mississippi to migrate to Oklahoma in what is now called the Trail of Tears. Let's review. The United States movement west and its singular approach to Native American civilizations devalued indigenous diversity and culture. These policies towards indigenous civilizations were used to justify the seizure and sale of native lands, although native cultures had controlled and managed their land for centuries. Many early historians, like Bancroft, reinforced this singular approach to native cultures by crafting false narratives. These narratives portrayed all native cultures and histories the same way, as uncivilized or even non-existent, which influenced the textbooks that taught countless generations of American school children. It's up to us to look back at this history with fresh eyes to better understand Native American culture. Now, you're ready for the final guiding question. Why have traditional views and misconceptions towards indigenous histories and cultures persisted in American society? Treating native cultures as one single, uncivilized group creates the impression that United States history began with colonization and the Revolutionary War, ignoring the fact that indigenous civilizations had existed in North America for thousands of years. Like many early colonists and Americans, some people in the 19th and 20th centuries saw American culture as exceptional because it was created out of political values rather than ethnicity or religion, driving the creation of a continental and then global empire. In this course, we hope to explore the way a singular view leads to historical pitfalls, creating misconceptions and misunderstandings about the processes that created the different visions of America. Why? Because we want you to keep making history. Hey!